The office air felt heavier that afternoon. I was leaning over the desk, reviewing reports that never seemed to end, the computer screen reflecting a cold, impersonal light. Clock on the wall marked the end of the workday, but the feeling that the day wouldn't end anytime soon was almost physical. Piles of paper in front of me were a constant reminder that the work never disappeared, it just multiplied. Every number, every formula seemed to demand more from me, and the more I tried to move forward, the more the feeling of exhaustion enveloped me. I was so immersed in this sea of numbers and text that I barely heard the glass door open softly until he entered. The boss. Tall, confident, always impeccably dressed in suits that seemed molded to his body. His presence filled the room in a way I couldn't explain. He had a way of walking that exuded confidence, as if each step were calculated, directed. The way he moved seemed to set the rhythm of the office, and everyone around him, including me, seemed small in the face of this imposing presence. "How's the report going, Laura?" he asked, his deep, calm voice filling the space, reverberating with an authority that left no room for doubt. He wasn't just asking about the progress of my work. In some way, he was measuring something else, something I couldn't quite identify yet. I looked up, feeling the tension in every muscle of my body. Our eyes met, and I felt vulnerable under the weight of those intense eyes. It was as if he were analyzing me deeply, not just as the employee there to deliver reports, but as something more. Something I didn't want to face, but that was becoming impossible to ignore. The interest he showed wasn't obvious, but it was there, camouflaged beneath a thin layer of formality and control. It was the way he looked at me, with an intensity that seemed to suggest he knew more about me than I wanted him to know. I straightened up in my chair, feeling the tight fabric of my blouse slide slightly across my skin. I didn't know if the tension I felt was because of the work or if there was something else, something not directly related to what I should have been doing at that moment. I wanted to believe it was just the former, the weight of responsibilities, the mental exhaustion that built up over the hours. But a part of me knew there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't define, but that made me feel uncomfortable and at the same time drawn to that incomprehensible energy. "It's almost ready. I just need to review a few parts," I replied, trying to keep my tone professional. My voice sounded lower than I'd like, as if I'd suddenly lost confidence. I couldn't help but feel a slight flush creeping up my face, a sign that my posture was wavering under his fixed gaze. I hated the fact that he had this power over me. He smiled slightly, a subtle gesture, but one that had the effect of thunder on a clear sky. That smile, almost imperceptible, made me feel a chill run down my spine and at the same time a strange warmth rising up my neck. It was a smile that knew something I didn't know. Something that made me want to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if he were challenging me to give in, to admit something I still refused to acknowledge. His gaze remained steady, almost challenging, as he leaned in slightly, getting even closer. The space between us seemed to shrink with each passing second, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. I wanted to push him away, take a step back, create some distance. But my body seemed stubbornly unwilling to cooperate. Instead, it felt magnetized by his proximity, as if something within me was eager to succumb to that charged atmosphere. The sensation of that closeness made my heart race, and I found myself trapped in a silent game he seemed to master effortlessly, without needing to say a word more. He was testing my limits, and I knew he was aware of it. Without asking permission, he circled the desk and stopped by my side. The movement was smooth, almost imperceptible, but his body was now much closer than I ever could have imagined. He began to analyze the papers I was holding, as if it were the report that really mattered, but I knew something else was at play here. I felt his proximity. The woody scent he wore was subtle but striking, and my breath faltered for a moment. Every detail was amplified in my mind. The warmth emanating from his body, the texture of the suit he wore, the way he leaned over me. "You've been doing great work lately. I must admit I like your dedication," he said, leaning in slightly, his face now so close that I could feel the vibration of his voice. His arm brushed lightly against mine, and that made my heart race uncontrollably. Touch was brief, but intense enough to make me question whether he was commenting on the work alone or something else. something he didn't need to say out loud. "Thank you," I murmured, trying not to lose myself in that charged atmosphere of something I couldn't define, but that was palpable, like an invisible pressure wrapping around me. I felt that my words were becoming empty in the face of the strength of those unsaid emotions. He remained there, so close I could almost hear the rhythm of his breath. I was trying to focus on the papers in front of me, but the truth was, everything around me seemed to have faded away. The room, the computer, the reports. Everything seemed too small in the face of his presence. The heat from his body radiated, creating a silent tension between us. He was so close that I almost could hear the beat of his heart, although I was consumed by the sensation of his presence. His scent seemed to invade my thoughts, like a presence that settled without asking for permission. I became more aware than ever of the small nuances of the interaction, the involuntary brushing of our bodies, the lightness of his breath on my skin. Every second that passed seemed to stretch into an eternity I didn't know if I wanted to end or wished would never leave. "You know, Laura, I admire people who know how to carry themselves under pressure," he commented, his voice tone laden with an intention I wasn't sure about. But one thing was clear. He was playing a game I couldn't fully understand and maybe didn't even want to. "I try to do my best," I replied, feeling the tension rise with every passing second. But inside, my words seemed to waver. He distracted me, and I became distracted, completely surrendered to that atmosphere that enveloped me. I wanted to resist, but I didn't know how. He leaned in a little more, resting his elbow on the arm of my chair, closing the distance between us even more. I felt his breath so close, the heat radiating from his body. My body seemed to long for something more, something I knew couldn't happen, but that, somehow, I couldn't deny. Every fiber of my being wanted to give in, wanted to surrender to that silent tension, but my mind screamed at me to control myself, to pull away. But what was this, if not an internal struggle between reason and desire? "And you do it very well," he murmured. His gaze held mine, and for a moment the office around us ceased to exist. The soft light of the room, the distant sound of conversations, everything fading away. There was only him, his smile, and the way he looked at me. I didn't know how to react, whether I should do something or stay still. The air was thick, and I no longer knew if I was drowning or being saved. "Maybe we should get back to work," I said, trying to escape that suffocating yet delicious atmosphere. My words came out more fragile than I imagined, as if the simple act of speaking was too much for my body. I was completely out of control, but refused to admit it. "Sure," he said, but without moving. His voice seemed to have a peculiar power, almost as if each word were an invisible rope keeping me tied to the place, to the moment. He still hadn't moved away, he was still there, watching me, waiting for something. It was as if he expected me to take the initiative to restore normalcy, but I didn't know if I had the strength to do that. We stayed like that for a few more seconds, in a silence full of unsaid meanings. I felt the weight of that moment as if it were embedded in every detail, in every exchange of glances, in the small distances between us and the ones he seemed intent on reducing. He seemed to be waiting for something, what exactly I didn't know, but somehow I already had the feeling that he knew more about me than I wanted him to. I was about to give in, and he knew it. I knew it. Finally, he stood up, adjusting his suit with an elegant gesture, as if it were the most natural movement in the world, as if the tension that lingered between us was just another insignificant detail. But to me it wasn't. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the exchange, with the unsaid that floated in the air. "If you need me, you know where to find me," he said before leaving the office. His words were like a whisper in the air, laden with an implied promise that I didn't know how to interpret. He left behind his woody scent, a trace that remained in the room, unyielding, like a constant reminder of what had just happened. But there was something more, something stronger than the smell. It was the tension, still hanging in the air, dense, palpable, almost like a presence. And I knew that this moment hadn't ended there. It was just the beginning of something I didn't yet fully understand. As soon as he left, I took a deep breath, trying to regain control of myself. My fingers were still slightly trembling, the papers I was holding almost slipping from my hands. I needed to focus on the work, as if that were a way to erase everything that had just happened. But no matter how much I tried, my focus was diluted between the numbers on the computer screen and the memory of that proximity, that intense gaze. Every part of me wanted to concentrate, but my mind was more occupied trying to understand what that meant. What had that moment been? Just a professional exchange, or was there something more happening there? I didn't know, but something told me that this meeting had been just the first of many, and that somehow, he was starting to become a constant presence in my life. I looked out the window, trying to distance myself from the conflicting sensations that still dominated my mind. The city outside seemed normal, unchanged by the tension of the office. But inside me, something had shifted. I didn't know exactly what, but the feeling persisted like a small, steady flame beginning to burn in my chest. It was a desire, a curiosity, a need to understand what was happening there. I was trying to get back to work, but the weight of his presence was still in every corner of the office, in every breath I took. The sound of my own heartbeat mixed with the whisper of the tension he left behind. But what intrigued me the most was that, the more I thought about him, the more I realized I didn't want him to leave. I wanted more. More of that proximity, of that silent game he offered me, and more of the sensations he stirred in me without saying a word. I knew something was about to happen between us, something I didn't yet know how to control, but that somehow irresistibly drew me in. The door opened again, interrupting my thoughts. My body reacted before my mind could process. He was back, and something in the way he entered, with his firm posture and controlled steps, made my heart race faster. He looked at me again, with those eyes that seemed capable of reading my soul. A soft smile formed on his lips, but there was something in his expression that made me feel as though I was being watched in a more intimate, deeper way. I was on alert, but I didn't know how to react. The words, which normally came to me easily, seemed to escape me. "You seem distracted," he remarked, with a lightness in his voice that disguised the intensity behind his words. His proximity made my stomach churn. He knew exactly how to affect me, how to leave me in a state of doubt and excitement. Every move he made seemed calculated, designed to throw me off balance. "I was just finishing some details," I replied, my voice quieter than I would have liked. I felt vulnerable, exposed, as if I was being tested in a way I didn't know how to endure. He took a step forward, and my body instantly felt the change in the air. Tension that had separated us was disappearing, and everything around me seemed to fade, focusing only on him. I wanted to push him away, but the desire for him to stay was much stronger. The heat of his presence enveloped me, consumed me, and I could no longer discern what was the right thing to do. "I appreciate when someone is dedicated, Laura," he said, almost like a whisper, his voice deep but soft. He leaned in a bit more, and my breathing grew heavier. His scent, the warmth of his body, the sound of his voice, all of it made me feel a mix of discomfort and pleasure. He had the ability to unsettle me, but at the same time, he made every second by his side feel more electrically charged. I didn't know what to do, how to react, and it left me feeling ungrounded. I watched him, trying to maintain a professional expression, but it was impossible to deny the way he made me feel. I wanted to push him away, but at the same time, I wondered what would happen if I gave in to that proximity. What would happen if I allowed the thin line between us to break? He seemed to have the answer, and I still didn't know if I was ready to hear it. He stood there beside me, closer than would have been comfortable. I could feel the intensity of his gaze on me, as though he were examining every little reaction I had. He didn't need to touch me for me to know that he was in control of the situation. His presence already made my body respond in ways I couldn't control. And the strangest part was that I didn't want it to end. Tension was almost hypnotic. "Is everything okay, Laura?" he asked, his voice laced with a tone that made the question sound more like a provocation, a way of confirming how much he affected me. I knew he was testing me, but somehow I also felt like I was surrendering to this test. Something in me wanted more. The feeling of his gaze fixed on me made my body respond instinctively. I knew he was aware of it, and still, he didn't seem willing to give up. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew that the desire was mutual. Even if I tried to run, something inside me pulled me back into that atmosphere, charged with possibilities. With every step he took, the space between us shrank, making everything feel more real, more palpable. I could no longer focus on anything but him, on how his movements were controlled, how he seemed to always be in charge, while I found myself at the mercy of something I still didn't fully understand. He stepped back a bit, but the feeling that he was still there, watching me, persisted. I was lost between what I wanted and what I was supposed to want. But the truth was, at that moment, I didn't want to fight it anymore. I didn't want to resist the attraction, the tension, the curiosity he had awakened in me. He didn't need to say anything more. Communication had already been made in the silence, in the exchanged glances, in the way our bodies seemed to call to each other. And when he finally stepped away, leaving the office once again, I knew without a doubt that the story between us was far from over. It was just beginning, and I could hardly wait to see where it would lead us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone you think would love to hear it too. Your engagement is essential for us to keep bringing more content like this. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Thank you for watching and see you next time.